English made easy. Hey guys! Bored of those vocab lists? Me too. At 1 Degree North Companion, we're turning wordly wise into an adventure to make learning actually interesting. Let's jump in.
You've probably heard someone praised for having the Midas touch, right? It sounds amazing, like they turn every single thing they do into a success. But what if I told you the real story of Midas isn't a success story at all? It's actually a pretty terrifying warning about what happens when you get exactly what you think you want. So, let's get into it.
So, let me ask you, if you could turn everything you touch to gold, would that be pure rapture? Just complete and total joy? Or would it end in consternation, just absolute horrified shock? It's a heck of a question, isn't it? To figure it out, we have to get inside the head of the man who got that very gift, King Midas himself.
See, to get how this dream wish turned into a total nightmare, you have to get the man himself. This wasn't just some random bad luck. No, his downfall was baked right into his personality. So let's do a little psychological profile of King Midas.
Okay, first things first. Midas was a guy who loved excess. The perfect word for him? Lavish. We're talking over the top, more than enough, cost is no object kind of guy. So when this fella, Silenus, who happened to be a friend of the god Dionysus, wanders into his kingdom, Midas doesn't just, give him a guest room. Oh no, he throws a massive, days-long party.
And this right here shows you everything you need to know about him. He's putting on these incredible banquets, the best food, non-stop music. All of it was to gratify his guest, basically to please him in every way possible. And yeah, it seems generous, right? But underneath it all is this dangerous idea that more is always better. And that belief, well, it's about to be put to the ultimate test. But here's where we see the first big red flag. Midas was impetuous. That means he was hasty. He acted without thinking things through. Just pure impulse. So when the god offers him a reward for being such a great host, Midas doesn't even take a breath to consider it. And if that wasn't bad enough, he was also haughty. So not only does he act without thinking, but he's also arrogant about it, just full of pride, totally dismissive of anyone else's opinion or advice. You see where this is going, right? Being impetuous is one thing, but being impetuous and haughty, man, that is a recipe for absolute disaster.
And this is the moment everything changes. The god Dionysus literally tries to warn him. He basically says, hey, maybe think this through, you're being a little impetuous. But does Midas listen? Nope. He haughtily rejects the advice. His pride is so huge he won't even take a hint from a god. And just like that, his own ego seals his fate.
All right, so now we get to see what happens when these personality flaws slam head-on into divine power. This is it. This is where it all goes wrong, leading to one of the most tragic stories you'll ever hear.
So Midas, not thinking for a single second, just blurts out his wish. He doesn't ponder, he doesn't weigh the pros and cons. All he sees is shiny, endless gold. And Dionysus, well, he tried to warn him. He just grants the wish.
And can you just imagine that first moment? The excitement? He runs out to test it, plucks an apple from a tree, and poof! In his hand, it instantly becomes solid, heavy, gleaming gold. His wildest fantasy is real.
At this point, Midas is in a state of what you'd call rapture. Just pure, overwhelming joy and delight. He thinks he's hit the jackpot, that he's the luckiest, most powerful man in the world.
So he's completely caught up in this feeling, this rapture, and he does what any of us would do. He sees the one person he loves more than anything, his daughter, and he runs to her, to sweep her up in a big hug and share his amazing news.
And then, it happens. That beautiful moment of rapture instantly flips into sheer consternation. We're talking shock, horror. The thing that brought him so much joy becomes the cause of his absolute deepest pain. Because his daughter, the person he loved more than any gold, is suddenly just a statue. Another cold, golden thing in his palace. In that single awful moment, Midas is left completely prostrate with grief, just destroyed, utterly helpless and weak, facing the terrible reality of his own greedy, unthinking wish. He got the greatest power imaginable, and it made him completely powerless. So you might be thinking, okay, that's a sad story, but it's just a myth, right? Why does it still matter? Well, because this story is so much more than that. It's actually woven deep into our history, our language, and even the real-world map.
Okay, let's unpack some of this amazing background. For starters, Phrygia, that was a real place, a super wealthy kingdom in what we now call Turkey, and it probably sparked the whole legend. And the god, Dionysus? He was the god of wine and wild parties, and his gifts are always a test. They looked great on the surface, but they were designed to expose your character flaws. That's why the Midas touch, which we use as a compliment today, was originally a terrifying warning. And get this wasn't the only time Midas's bad judgment got him in trouble. There's another whole myth where he gets donkey ears for being so haughty. The guy just couldn't help himself.
You know that word we used earlier, rapture? Let's dig into that for a sec, because it's fascinating. It comes from a Latin word, rapere, which means to seize. How perfect is that? Midas was literally seized by his joy. It grabbed hold of his common sense and wouldn't let go. The warning was right there in the word itself.
So, after all that, after this ancient, cautionary tale, the story kind of turns the mirror back on us. It makes us ask some pretty tough questions about what we desire. Because what this myth really hammers home is the huge critical difference between what you want and what you truly need. What we want is so often just an impetuous whim, right? A fleeting desire that can lead to total consternation if we get it. But what we need, that's the deep stuff. Connection, love, life. That's where real happiness is. Midas got exactly what he wanted, and it cost him everything he actually needed. And that leaves us with this final thought. If you were given that privilege, that one incredible wish from a god, would you fall into the same golden trap? Would you let an impetuous whim decide your fate? Or would you take the time to truly ponder what you need before the things that matter most are just untouchable?
Hope you guys enjoyed that last lesson. If you did, smash that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell. Ready for more? The next one starts right now.
Let's go back in time. It's New York City, 1911. The air is practically humming with energy. It's a powerhouse of industry, built on the dreams and, on the backs of millions of immigrants who are pouring into America, all looking for a new life. For so many of these young women, getting a job at a place like the Triangle Shirtwaist Company, well, that was their foothold in this brand new world. They made something called a shirtwaist, which was this really stylish blouse, kind of a symbol of the new independent working woman. But the promise of America, as they were about to find out, often came with an absolutely terrible price. Because the reality inside these factories, these so-called sweatshops, was just brutal. I'm talking impossibly long hours for pay that was just desperately low. And the irony? It's just devastating. A piece of clothing that symbolized freedom was being made in conditions that were literally a fire trap just waiting to be sprung. The perfect word for it is congested. Picture this. Hundreds of workers packed elbow to elbow, squeezed between these bulky sewing machines. And all around them, piles and piles of flammable fabric scraps, with the air itself just thick with lint. It was a tinderbox, really, just waiting for a spark. And if there's one word that captures the massive failure at the heart of this whole story, it's this: LAX. Safety standards, they were practically non-existent. Fire inspections were careless, if they even happened at all. And the equipment they had on hand, totally inadequate. It was just a disaster playing out in slow motion. All of this made the tragedy feel, inevitable. With conditions like these, it was never a question of if a fire would break out, but when. And that when came on Saturday, March 25th, 1911.
To really understand the speed and the pure terror of what happened next, we just need a few key words. They paint a picture of the chaos that just erupted on the top floors of that building.
It all started quietly. A fire in a scrap bin on the 8th floor didn't just burst into flames. It began to smolder. It burned slow, hidden, putting out smoke without any visible fire. So it went completely unnoticed until it was way, way too late.
And then that smolder exploded into flames. An acrid, choking smoke just instantly filled the room. And we're not talking about normal smoke. This was a sharp, blinding cloud filled with chemicals that made it impossible to see, impossible to breathe. Panic just erupted. The workers made a headlong rush for the exits, a reckless, totally desperate stampede. In the smoky darkness, people were trampled. It was absolute chaos.
But for these workers, the fire was only the beginning of the horror. You see, the people on the 10th floor actually managed to escape to the roof, and the workers on the 8th floor where the fire started, they were warned in time. But the women on the 9th floor, they were trapped. The very design of their workplace, which was meant to control them, now sealed their fate.
Every single path to safety was blocked, on purpose, designed to impede their movement.
What stood between these women and survival wasn't just a fire. It was a series of calculated business decisions.
The owners regularly locked the doors from the outside to keep the workers from taking unauthorized breaks. The main stairway was less than 3 feet wide, creating a deadly bottleneck. Only one of the 4 elevators was even working, and the fire escape, the very last hope for so many, it was so flimsy that it buckled and collapsed under their weight.
So now, they're trapped, with locked doors behind them and flames closing in. They faced a choice that is just unthinkable. What happened next would be burned into the city's memory forever.
They began to jump, first one by one, and then in groups. Dozens of women leaped from the 9th floor windows. They fell 85 feet to the pavement below. This horrifying act of sheer desperation just shows you how completely hopeless their situation was.
Down on the street, firefighters arrived, but they were totally unable to cope with the disaster. They could only stand there and watch, helpless, as this tragedy unfolded high above their heads.
So why couldn't they cope? Well, their equipment was just fatally mismatched for the city's new skyscrapers. The water from their hoses couldn't even reach the 8th floor. And their ladders? They were too short. They only reached the 6th floor. They had no way to fight the fire, and no way to rescue the people trapped inside.
In the days that followed, the city's shock and grief started to harden into this raw demand for accountability. 146 people, mostly young immigrant women and girls, were dead, and New York demanded to know why. And get this, among the horrified onlookers that day was a young social reformer named Frances Perkins. Seeing this horror so profoundly affected her that she would eventually become the Secretary of Labor, and she later called this the day the New Deal was born.
A silent throng of over 100,000 New Yorkers took to the streets for the mass funeral. This wasn't just a crowd. It was this powerful, silent protest, a river of grief and anger just flowing through the city.
The factory owners were put on trial, accused of manslaughter. The city expected justice. I mean, it seemed like a clear-cut case of criminal negligence, a fatal failure to provide even the most basic safety for their workers.
But that is not what they got. The owners were acquitted, found not guilty. Because the safety laws were so lax, their lawyers successfully argued they hadn't technically broken any. For each of the 146 lives that were lost, their families received a payment of just $75. The owners, meanwhile, collected over $60,000 in insurance, which was a massive amount of money at the time.
This verdict, it turned the city's grief into something else entirely. New Yorkers were now irate. This wasn't just sadness anymore. This was pure fury at a system that so clearly valued profits over the lives of its workers. And that fury, that anger, became the catalyst for one of the most important moments in the history of labor and safety reform in America. The fire's real legacy would be written in law. You see, that public anger forced politicians to act. They had no choice. They had to initiate sweeping new investigations into factory conditions. The old, lax rules were torn up. They were replaced with stringent new laws that mandated fire drills, sprinkler systems, and unlocked exits. And fire departments were forced to improve their equipment to finally match the city's growing skyline.
You know, this tragedy was never inevitable. It was the direct result of negligence, and it leaves us with a really critical question. How do we prevent this kind of negligence from happening again? We have to look around our own workplaces, our own communities, and make sure that the lessons that were paid for with 146 lives are never, ever forgotten.
Thanks so much for watching. Hope you enjoyed today's show. If you did, hit that like button, subscribe, and ring the bell so you never miss an update. I'll see you in the next one.